If a fortune teller told you you would survive an earthquake and a shipwreck, would you still get on Titanic? 19-year-old Helen Bishop sure did. She was 19 years old and had just married 23-year-old widower Dickinson Bishop. They were both pretty wealthy. Helen's father owned the Royal Easy Chair Company, which was kind of an early lazy boy, and when Dickinson's first wife died, she left him a major share in the Round Oak Stove Company. When they first met, Dickinson was still in mourning, still wearing black, so they spent a lot of time together. There was a lot of compassion, which quickly turned to love. So they got married and went on a very expensive honeymoon to Algiers, Egypt, Italy, and France. And when they were in Egypt, Helen saw a fortune teller who told her that she would survive a shipwreck, then survive an earthquake, but would ultimately meet her death in a car accident. And that will all come into play later. Dickinson bought her so many gifts on their honeymoon, including a little lapdog called Frou Frou. And then they discovered that Helen was pregnant. Their honeymoon was going great. And then they started hearing about Titanic and seeing advertisements for Titanic and how lavish and luxurious it was supposed to be, so they figured that would be a good way to end their honeymoon and head back to the States. They made a lot of friends in first class, including none other than Madeline Astor. On April 14th, when Titanic hit the iceberg, Helen had already gone to bed, and Dickinson was reading the newspaper. Neither of them felt or heard anything, but a few minutes later, someone knocked on the door and told Dickinson, "Hey, I think the ship hit something." So he woke up Helen, said, "Let's go up on deck, better safe than sorry." Helen sent Dickinson back to their room because she was cold and needed some more things, and while she was still on deck, she encountered John Jacob Astor, Madeline's husband, and John told her, "Hey, the captain says we all need to put on life jackets. We might need to get into lifeboats while they assess the damage." Helen rushes back to her cabin, tells Dickinson, and they put on their lifeboats, and unfortunately, they leave Frou Frou in the cabin because they're under the impression that this is a precaution and Frou Frou will be there when they get back. They go back to A deck. There's a bit of confusion as to what exactly is going on, but ultimately, Helen is the very first person on Titanic to board a lifeboat. And Dickinson claimed that while he was helping Helen onto the lifeboat, a hand pushed him from behind and he ended up on the lifeboat as well. People are starting to get pretty nervous on the lifeboat, but Helen is comforting them, saying, "Hey, it's okay because we have to be rescued because the fortune teller told me I would survive a shipwreck." The lifeboat rode about a mile away from Titanic, and Helen later described, "For a moment, the ship seemed to be pointing straight down, looking like a gigantic whale submerging itself headfirst." She also described the death cries and groans she heard as the ship went down. They were, of course, rescued by Carpathia and taken back to New York City. Originally, they planned to go straight home to Michigan, but because they had lost all their clothes and so much of Helen's jewelry on Titanic, they decided to stay at the Waldorf Astoria to do some shopping. And while in New York, they were asked to speak at the US Senate inquiry in regard to the Titanic sinking. And when Dickinson was called forth to testify, they asked him if he had heard an order to stand back and let women and children board first. And he said no, absolutely not. This was a really touchy subject for him, as well as a lot of other male survivors, because they were getting harassed and berated by reporters for lacking chivalry, basically, even though the order for women and children first was not given at every lifeboat. And then more rumors came about in the newspapers where people were suggesting that he disguised himself as a woman to board a lifeboat. In December of 1912, their son Randall was born and sadly died 2 days later. The next spring, in the midst of their grief, they went on a vacation to California where they were caught in an earthquake. And Helen became very scared because to her, this meant that the second part of her prophecy had come true and the automobile accident would come next. In 1914, Helen went to a country club dance with some friends. On their way home, their car spun out of control and they ran into a tree. I don't want to be super graphic, but she was thrown from the car and landed on her head. Initially, they did not expect her to survive, but they had this steel plate inserted into her head, and she was released from the hospital a few weeks later. Because of this, she had a major personality change. She blamed Dickinson for the accident, and they eventually divorced in 1916. And a few months after this, she was visiting some friends in Illinois, and she slipped on a rug and hit her head right next to where the steel plate had been inserted, and she never woke up, and she died a few days later. And in an absolutely horrible coincidence, her obituary was published on the first page of the local newspaper right alongside an article announcing Dickinson's third marriage. Dickinson served in World War I and moved with his wife to Ottawa. But as was the case for many Titanic survivors, everything he did was overshadowed by the tragedy of Titanic. In 1961, he died from a stroke and was buried at Ottawa Avenue Cemetery.